Okay, today we are looking at the book of Job, and we are going to get an introduction to this book. I'm only going to cover the first 5 verses. There's a lot of depth to the book, but I thought, first of all, let us have a background to this book, and then we will go into studying this book in detail in the days to come. The manner in which I'm going to be taking is I'm going to take the first and the second chapter, break it down, and take it in a few sessions. And then I'm going to cover 3 important chapters in the book of Job, which are called as the witness chapters or the witness passages. And then after that, I will bring a conclusion to the whole book. Now, in summary, when we look at this particular book, it doesn't address the problem of suffering at all. Some people think that this is a good book to study the nature of suffering and get some answers to the problem of suffering. But this book, though it talks about unjust suffering and extreme suffering, it is not an answer to the problem of sufferings at all. Rather, it addresses a major theological problem, which was important not just in the very ancient days, but it's still important to us today. And the issue is, is this equation true, that blessing is equal to righteousness and suffering is equal to sin? Many people in today's world, especially from the believing community and even more so in the Baptist and the Pentecostal churches, is that they think that blessing is equal to righteousness and suffering is equal to sin. So if you're suffering, that means you've done something wrong, or your grandfather did something wrong, or whatever it is, you're suffering because there is sin, the hook of sin in your life. And if you're blessed and you're prospering nicely, that means you're a very righteous person, and God is blessing you and rewarding you for that. The book of Job actually demolishes this idea. It shows that suffering is not because of sin or evil, nor is blessing because of righteousness. And therefore, this book is not really, and technically speaking, an answer to the problem of suffering. But there is a lot that we can learn about the value of genuine faith in the chapters of this book. And in fact, this book provides for us unbelievable faith. Now, it is very nice to use adjectives and say unbelievable faith. But the truth is, you can't really believe the volume of faith until I process each of you through those witness passages. And it will be so surprising to see the great, enormous degree of faith which is able to reconstruct the council in heaven. And so today we will just look at an introduction to the book of Job from Job chapter 1, verses 1 to 5. Now, let me read the text for you from the first to the 5th verse of the first chapter of the book of Job. In the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and a large number of servants. He was the greatest man among all the people of the East. His sons used to hold feasts in their homes on their birthdays, and they would invite their 3 sisters, to eat and drink with them. When the period of feasting had run its course, Job would make arrangements for them to be purified. Early in the morning, he would sacrifice a burnt offering to each of them, thinking, perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. This was Job's regular custom. Now, the first thing that we see here is in the land of Uz. Now, where is this place called Uz? In the Old Testament, we read 2 people named after the name of Uz. And probably from them, the cities developed. So one was, of course, the son of Aram. The Arameans trace their origin to Aram, who was the son of Sheph, who was the son of Noah. And the second man named Uz was the grandson of Seir, the Hurrian who settled in the area. Later it was called as Mount Seir, which eventually fell into Esau's hand. And this man's name was This was the place, which was probably the original source of the writing of this book. And therefore, this predated the period of Esau and Jacob. So this place that we talk about as Uz is a region in or near Edom, as seen in Lamentations chapter 4 and verse 21. Now, if you look into Lamentation and read chapter 4 and verse 21, I'm reading it for you. Okay, it says, "Rejoice and be glad, daughters of Edom, who live in the land of Uz. But to you also the cup will be passed." I mean, rejoice and be glad, daughter of Edom, who live in the land of Uz. So the name Uz from this text tells us that it predated the time when it fell into the hands of Esau. So this means that the original source of writing of this book predated the period of Esau and Jacob. Because Esau later on went and brought this into Edomite territory. So here the text in Lamentation says, "Be rejoice and be glad, daughter of Edom, who live in the land of Uz." So Edomites were now dwelling in the land of Uz. Therefore, the name Uz predated the time Esau came and settled there, or Edom came and settled there. That means this book was probably written before Esau settled in that place. That means this book was written before the period of Esau and Jacob. So that's what we can understand from the land of Uz. And it gives us the time when probably the book would have been written. So obviously we know this much, that it was written before the time of Esau and Jacob. Then the second observation we can understand from this text about the background is this, that it says there lived a man whose name was Job. Now, who is this man and what is his background? Normally in the Bible and in the Old Testament, when any man's name is mentioned, his genealogy or his background is also mentioned. But nothing like that is mentioned. It just says there lived a man whose name was Job. And there are no references as a result to Israel's history. That means this man would have therefore lived long before the Israelites settled in Canaan. There is no mention of Abraham or Moses or judges or kings, and yet we find the book being accepted into the canon of the Bible. There is also no reference to the 10 Commandments or any of the Mosaic laws. The discussions deal with right and wrong in this book, judgment and favor, reward and punishment, but not in the context of the revelation that God gave at Mount Sinai. So there are no references to Israel's history in the text of the book of Job, which means this book was written long before the history of the nation of Israel. So that is the second observation that becomes visible, not just studying this passage, but any of the passages of the book of Job, it becomes visible to us. Then the next observation about the background is this, that it says whose name was Job. Now, all that we know about this man Job, that he was one of the leading citizens and he was highly respected by the people of the land. How do we know? Because in the third verse it says he was the greatest man among all the people of the East. And then when we read Job 29, and let me open this Job chapter 29 and read it out for you. Job 29 verses 7 to 10. Okay, I'm reading. "When I went to the gate of the city and took my seat in the public square, young men saw me and stepped aside, and old men rose to their feet. The chief men refrained from speaking and covered their mouths with their hands. The voices of the nobles were hushed, and their tongues stuck to the roof of their mouths." 11th verse, "Whoever heard me spoke well of me, and those who saw me commended me." So Job was one of the leading citizens. The fact that he took his seat in the public square means that he had the role of a judge as a respected citizen of that entire area. So that's what we read about Job what he's talking about himself in the 29th chapter, verses 7 to 11. And then in the same 29th chapter and the 25th verse, we read, I chose the way for them and sat as their chief. I dwelt as a king among his troops. I was like one who comforts mourners. So the text says, I dwelt like a king among his troops. So he had a huge range of influence in the area in which he lived. And that is what we can know from the few scattered passages about the background of this person named Job. This observation is also visible in this passage we are reading, as well as in other passages of the book of Job. Then the fourth observation we can see is that the name Job, though not used elsewhere in the Bible for another person, the name was found in Sumerian clay tablets that were discovered in Mesopotamia and other places. The name of Job in Sumerian clay tablets meant that it was a person from the Abrahamic or the pre-Abrahamic period. There also existed in the story of Job, in among the Mesopotamian myths, a story called Ludlul Bel Nimaki. And scholars often refer to it as the Babylonian Job. And the text of it is available. And if you go to some ancient sources, which I showed you the other day when I was talking about books that help us in understanding the Bible better, then if you read those books, you will be able to read the whole text of Ludlul Bel Nimaki. So the name Job, not found anywhere else in the Bible. Yeah, there is one place in the book of Genesis, but there the name is spelled not as J-O-B, or in the Hebrew it becomes Y, Yod, the character Yod comes, but the name there is I-O-B, so it's not, and sometimes people think that is a reference to another Job in the Bible, but I don't know, that's only found in the Masoretic text, it's not found in the other texts of the Hebrew language. So technically speaking, the name Job is only found in the book of Job, and if it is found anywhere else in the Bible, it is only found in reference to this character Job that we are seeing in this passage today and in this book today. So the name of Job is not found anywhere else in the Bible for any other person. This means there is something unusual about the name of Job, that it was not a Hebrew name, and therefore it was not found among the Hebrew people. As we try to understand this a little further, the name of Job is found in a number of clay tablets from 2000 BC. These tablets include the Akkadian tablets from Tel El Amarna, Mari, and Alalak. Also, it is found in the execration text from Egypt. In fact, the name Bildad also occurs in many cuneiform texts of this particular period. So you find that this is found, that this name is found in many Mesopotamian texts and also in the ancient Egyptian execration texts. Now, this this means that this is more a Mesopotamian name, just like Abraham is also a Mesopotamian name. Benjamin is a Mesopotamian name. Okay, Benjamin is found in the Mesopotamian tablets as Banu Yamin, which transliterated in the English becomes Benjamin. So the name of Job is found in other places outside the Bible, but it's inside the Bible. It's not found in any other place. So very obviously, it's not a Hebrew name, but certainly a Semitic name, and it is found in many of the other places outside the Bible. This means that the name of the person and the person himself belong to a period long before the biblical passages were written. Of course, the few places in which Job is mentioned in the Bible is that he is described as a historical paragon of righteousness. For example, we can look into Ezekiel chapter 14, and it comes in two places in that. In the 14th verse, it says, even if these three men, Noah, Dan, Daniel, and Job. Even if these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it, they could only save themselves by their righteousness, declares the Lord. The same thing is repeated in the 20th verse of Ezekiel chapter 14. So here we see that Job, along with Daniel and Noah, is described as a historical paragon of righteousness in the Hebrew scriptures. Then in the book of James also we read that in the 5th chapter and the 11th verse, this is in the New Testament, a reference to Job. And here we find James telling us, as you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought out. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. So, Job is mentioned again as a character with indomitable perseverance. In spite of everything going against him, he is described as the epitome of an example of righteousness. So that's what we see about Job in the Bible. Other than the name Job to Job, no other person in the Bible we find as named Job. And this indicates that Job was not a part of the biblical writing, but it was a book that was written long before any of the Bible passages were written. So that's what we can understand from this observation. And then in the first verse, it also says, this man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. Now, this man, if Job lived before the time of the writing of scriptures, this meant that divine laws existed before the period of Moses. That's what it means. In fact, in Genesis chapter 26 and verse 5, we read God telling that Abraham obeyed me and did everything I required of him, keeping my commands, my decrees, and my instructions. Now, Abraham did not have the writings of Moses, because Moses is a descendant of Abraham. So the book of Exodus, the book of Leviticus, the book of Numbers, Deuteronomy were not in the hand of Abraham. He didn't have the so-called written scriptures that the Jewish people and the Israelite people had. But the divine laws did exist at that time. Okay. And we read over here in Genesis 26 and verse 5 that Abraham obeyed and did everything I required of him, keeping my commands, my decrees, and my instructions. We also know that long before the biblical passages were written, in 1754 BC, was the Hammurabi's Code of Law. So Code of Law already existed before, long before the Mosaic laws were written. And if we go even further than that, we have in 1934 to 1924 BC, that's even older than the Hammurabi's Code of Law, we have the Sumerian Code of Lipit Ishtar. So when we look at world extra biblical records, we know that written records of laws and ethics existed long before the book of Job. So that means divine laws existed before the period of Moses. And when we look at Job chapter 23, we can see this important truth about these divine laws. Job chapter 23 and verse 12, I'm reading for you. I have not departed from the commands of his lips. I have treasured the words of his mouth more than my daily bread. This is what Job is saying to vindicate himself. This just means that laws existed before. Okay, and again in Job chapter 22, and verse 22. Okay, Job 22 and verse 22, we read, accept instruction from his mouth and lay up his words in your heart. Okay, and this of course is the language of Eliphaz to Job. Eliphaz is telling Job, accept instruction from his mouth, that is God's mouth, and lay up his words in your heart. So that means this instruction, God's words and laws, they actually existed long before we have the compiled record of Moses from Genesis to the book of Deuteronomy. So divine laws did exist even before. And then as we look further into this passage, we read in the second verse, he had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and a large number of servants, a large number of servants. Now, wealth here is defined in terms of livestock. In fact, in Genesis 24:34, when Abraham's servant goes to Laban's house to bring Rebekah as wife for his Abraham's son Isaac. Okay, now Abraham's servant is telling to Laban about Abraham. So he said, I am Abraham's servant. The Lord has blessed my master abundantly and he has become wealthy. He has given him sheep and cattle, silver and gold, male and female servants, and camels and donkeys. So wealth is defined in terms of livestock. And we see this in many places in the book of Genesis, in Genesis 13 and verse 5, Genesis 24 verse 34, which I just read for you, Genesis 30 verse 43, and many more passages. So this characteristic of wealth being defined in terms of livestock, okay, is actually a typical characteristic of the patriarchal age, the age of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And it was the Mesopotamian culture at that time that wealth was defined in terms of livestock. And today, of course, when we define wealth, we probably define wealth, somebody being very rich, for example, like Ambani's in the Reliance Industries or something, we define a person's wealth in terms of dollars. So many $1 billion worth, American dollars actually, okay. So today we measure wealth in terms of billions of American dollars, okay. But in the ancient world, it was not the dollar currency that was valid, it was how many livestock you had. So this actually tells us that this is a period that is long before the time of the Israelites. Because by the time we come to the period of Solomon, wealth was not defined in terms of livestock. It was defined in terms of how much gold and silver you had. And in fact, describing the wealth of Solomon, it says that Solomon made silver as common as stones. Okay. So it's defining the wealth of Solomon in that way. Right? So the definition of wealth changed in the Israelite period, but this is the pre-Israelite period. And here we see that wealth is defined in terms of livestock. Then as we check further into this text, we see, not just this text, but even the rest of the book of Job, we find that the illustrations in the book of Job belong to the period of the book of Genesis. That there is no reference in this, in the book of Job to the Mosaic account of deliverance at the Red Sea, because this, the Red Sea deliverance is seen so frequently in all the passages of the Old Testament after the book of Exodus. Constantly in the Psalms, constantly in the Kings, and other books of the Old Testament, in the prophets, we find that they make reference to the Red Sea deliverance. Okay, we find that very often happening. Now, in this book, there is no reference to the Red Sea, okay, or the deliverance from Egypt. That means this book was written long before Israelites were either enslaved or delivered from Egypt. Most of the examples in this book are from the creation record, from the fall, Genesis chapter 3, from the flood, Genesis chapter 6 to 9, okay, and even it includes sometimes the dispersion of the people that took place at the Tower of Babel, which is in Genesis chapter 11. Then there are a number of ancient tribes that are mentioned, like Sabaeans and Chaldeans and Ophir, which are actually mentioned in the table of nations, which we find in Genesis chapter 10. This means that this book was probably written after the flood, but before Moses, or before the children of Israel were enslaved into Egypt. So the illustrations in the book of Job, the language even in the book of Job belongs to the period of the book of Genesis. I mean, the language of Genesis is also slightly different from the other books in the Bible. In fact, there are many words in the book of Genesis and even words in the book of Job that are more closer to the language of Ugarit, which is actually an ancient form of Hebrew, and it's a derivative from a Phoenician language. So this Ugaritic language helps us to understand not just the book of Genesis, but also the book of Job. So we find that the language of Job and the illustrations in the book of Job and all the illustrations and examples that we see over there are all belonging to the period of the book of Genesis. So very certainly this book was written long before any book in the Bible was written. In fact, as a result, we can boldly say it was the first book that was written in the Bible. The book of Genesis is, of course, handed over to us through Moses. Okay, but this book predated the writing of the book of Genesis and even the other books that Moses handed over to us. Then the last observation I could bring to you people over here is just this, that the sacrificial system defined here is pre-Mosaic. When we read the 5th verse, it says, when a period of feasting had run its course, Job would make arrangements for them to be purified. Early in the morning, he would sacrifice a burnt offering for each of them. Now, this particular sacrificial system is pre-Mosaic or pre-Israelite, you could say. Because in the period of the Israelites, it was a priest from the tribe of the Levite who would have to perform the purification rituals. But in the Abrahamic and the pre-Abrahamic period, what do we see? It would be the family, the eldest of the family would be the one to make the sacrifice for purification. We find this in Genesis chapter 8, verse 20, that after the flood had dissipated, Noah made a sacrifice of the approved animals and birds. Okay, then we read about Abraham in Genesis chapter 22. He goes to make to that Mount Moriah alone with his son, there to make a sacrifice to Yahweh, to Jehovah. And that time, who goes to make the sacrifice? It's the father who goes to make that sacrifice. And this was something that was understood in the ancient world. So when Abraham told Sarah, I'm going to make a sacrifice, she understood this is the family's eldest person, the household of the family, the chief of the family will have to go and do this. So this practice was actually pre-Mosaic or pre-Israelite. So we can understand from this passage that Job is making a sacrifice for the members of his family, thinking that they have probably sinned and cursed God in their heart. So let me make a purification sacrifice for them so that God will not hold them to judgment. Now, as a result of this, in fact, as a spin-off from this important truth, one thing comes to us very sharply and very strongly, and that is the father takes the responsibility of bringing up his family and children in godly ways. I don't know how many parents actually take up this responsibility of making sure that their children and their family comes up in godly ways. But this is a very important lesson, a tangential spin-off from this, a spiritual spin-off from this. That the father takes the keen responsibility of shaping the family in godly ways. And these are the things that we can look at in this background of the book of Job. And tomorrow onwards, I mean, from the next session onwards, I will go into learning the spiritual disciplines we can learn from the book of Job in chapter 1 and 2. And then I will introduce you to the faith of Job in those 3 witness passages. And with that, I can finish off the book of Job instead of simply going chapter by chapter, because there are 42 chapters to cover. And it is not necessary to cover all the 42. It is grand. It's beautiful. I mean, every chapter has got such a great degree of depth. You can stay immersed in it. But for the sake of time, I'm trying to compress and give you the core information of the book of Job. And so this book of Job is all about the faith of Job. In fact, in Romans chapter 5 and verses 3 to 5, it says, we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance produces character, and character produces hope. And hope does not disappoint us, because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. So that this critical truth that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance produces character, character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint us. This is one critical truth that we see in the whole book of Job. Now, I don't know where any of us are in our journey of faith, and maybe you would have been through something so cruel and so critical, and you might even think that does God really love me? And sometimes people put in their DP, they put their WhatsApp status. They put over there is their WhatsApp status will say over there, I am blessed. But some of us may feel that we are not blessed. You might even feel that maybe I'm cursed. I don't know if you're there. I don't know. It's in one of those, that I think this is in Dante's, that epic poem that he wrote. In that he says, abandon all hope, all ye who enter here. And he's talking about hell over there. Dante Alighieri is talking about hell. And he says, as the entrance to hell, it says, abandon all hope, all ye who enter here. Now, sometimes we may feel that all hope is lost. And we don't know if we ever can have a future. But the problem and the truth is this, very vivid truth is this, that it was a worse situation than that Job was himself in. Everything was taken away from him. And even his body was so badly afflicted. And yet, in spite of that, we see that Job persevered in his faith. This is the same thing that even James tells us about Job in the 5th chapter and in the 11th verse. And the truth is, hope never disappoints us. I don't know what crisis any of us are and any of you are, and if you're struggling and you're worried, and I can only assure you that if we don't forget our hope in God, irrespective of how dark the world may be, irrespective of coming to a point where you think that you've reached the end of the tunnel, expecting light, but there's only dark at the end of the tunnel, even then, don't ever lose your hope in God. Because no matter what happens in this world, God is still good, and his mercy endures forever. Don't lose your trust and your faith in God. Let us bow down our heads in prayer. Almighty and everlasting God, from whom to be turned is to fall, to whom to be turned is to rise, in whom to stand is to abide forever. Grant us in all our duties your help, in our confusion your guidance, in all dangers your protection, and in all our sorrows your peace. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.